celebrate National Quilting Day, I'm teaming up with fellow YouTube creators to share our favorite tips and tricks. You can find links to their videos in the description of this video. Foundation paper piecing, or FPP, is when you sew using papers so that you can do more intricate designs or use shapes and pieces that would be harder to do with just regular traditional piecing. But does it work with memory fabric? It does. Stay tuned and I'll show you how to do foundation paper piecing with memory fabric. Hi, if you're new here, I'm Julie Patterson of JCT Quilting and I want to help you turn your memories into quilted treasures. If you like what you see, please hit like and subscribe so that you can be notified when there are new videos. And if you have ideas for upcoming videos that you would like to see, please let me know in the comments. The tease is a quilt pattern for foundation paper piecing. It uses papers so that you can piece the arms and do the intricate shapes and keep them just where they need to be. And then you attach it to a middle piece. I made 2 quilts with quilting cotton. And in this video, I will show you how I also made one with memory or t-shirt fabric. The link for the tease pattern is in the description notes for this video. I start by getting my paper. The first section is B1. I'm gonna put a little dab of glue just to hold it in place, just washable Elmer's glue stick. And this is the sleeve fabric. So I'm gonna put that there. Now, to make sure I have it lined up correctly, I'm gonna hold this up to a light source, which I happen to have a window over here. I'm gonna hold it up to a light source and make sure that I have a little bit on each side, a little bit extra down here, and enough up here, so that I have all my seam allowances accounted for. And then on the next step, you'll see how I fold and measure a 1/4 inch, but this really should be, so I can line up my 1/4 inch on the seam. I'm gonna be sewing on this B1, B2 seam. I line up my 1/4 inch and I can see I'm just a hair over, which is totally fine, but it's not, for me, enough to worry about trimming that. So I'm gonna turn it over and I need to add my B2 piece, which I'm using this triangle. And to make sure I have that lined up correctly, I'm gonna take my ruler. I actually prefer to use it this way. Use the edge of the ruler and I can see through my paper. If you can't, you can make a dark mark on, what I'm looking for is this, this intersection point. And you can make a dark mark with a marker so it will for sure show through, but I can see it. And I'm gonna line the horizontal lines with the edge of my fabric, which I know was cut straight, and the edge of my ruler with that point. And that will help me line up. So I just want the point of my triangle to be on the edge of the ruler, so that I know it will be in line and it will flip correctly and it won't be wonky to the side. You can kind of see if it's going to work. You can pin it or just kind of hold it in place, fold it up, and I can see that it will cover all the seam allowances and go beyond the region I need. So that will work. I like to pin it in place. Some people don't, they'll just hold it and go to the machine. I like to do a few at a time. So I'm going to make sure it stays put and use a pin. I am using a flat pin. I want to make sure that it doesn't get caught up in the machine or add extra bulk while I'm trying to sew this. So I'm using a flat pin and making sure I pin far enough away from the seam allowance. Because you'll be sewing on this side, you won't actually see that pin. It's on the other side, so you don't really have a convenient opportunity to pull it. So it's helpful if you can just make sure you pin far enough away from where you'll be stitching. Okay, one is done. Okay, I'm now ready to do the A's. Same thing, it's just reversed. The side that which the fabric will be on this. If you're using multiple shirts, I know that this darker pink is in line with my first one, so I'm gonna do that one first. When I'm sewing multiple at the same time, I try to keep the order of them the same so it makes matching them up later a lot easier. So there's that. If you are using scrap fabric and not pre-cut, so you didn't maybe measure out this triangle in advance, which is totally fine and is one of the advantages of foundation paper piecing. You can just take your scrap and just go with it. But if that's what you're doing, you might not have to line up the triangle this way. You could be doing this with a rectangle or some random shape scrap that you have. But you will want to, like I did earlier, just kind of guesstimate a 1/4 inch, fold it over, and make sure it is going past that dotted seam allowance and that it goes past the seam allowance on this side, which is that line. Okay, my papers are all ready to be stitched. I'm going to go stitch on this line between A1 and A2. Here, I'm only going to try and do one little stitch over. I don't want to stop short of that line. I want to make sure it's fully captured so that I have an intersection here, but I don't need to go too far, or when I make A5, it'll be harder to fold the fabric back and measure, and you'll see. So I really just want like one stitch back here, and I'll back stitch a little bit here. And then here where I'm stitching, I want to make sure I stitch off the seam allowance. So I will go all the way through and I will back stitch over here. So I'm going to go stitch that line on all of these, and then we'll be back to prepare A3. Okay, I'm at my machine, and the first thing I'm going to do is lower my stitch length. You will want it 1.5, 1.6. I usually stick at about 1.6. Your machine does 1.5, that's great. If you want a shorter stitch, it will make ripping the paper a lot easier when we're done. The bigger stitch, or the normal stitch that you're used to, the paper will just kind of pull at the stitches. So you want to make sure you shorten your stitch length. And then I am using my 1/4 inch foot. I really like that the line that I'm sewing on just lines right up with that gap. And so it allows me to stitch and see it a lot better, I have found, than perhaps my regular foot, which does have a clear space, but it just doesn't have that guideline gap. So you'll see what I mean in a second when I'm sewing, but either is fine. Your regular foot is fine. I just have found that I really like this gap to line up my sewing line. It doesn't matter whether you start up here or down here, but remember to back stitch at both ends and just a little bit on this side. If you go further on this side, it's fine. You'll see it's not a big deal. But when we get to either B5 or A5, whichever piece you're working on, we fold it back, and it will be a little harder to fold back, but we can take care of it. It's not a problem either way. What's more important is that you back stitch. So if you need to go a little further to get that back stitch in, that's fine. You do want to make sure you at least get past that point. We don't want a hole in our stitches. So you want to make sure you get at least past that point, but this will be a thick intersection point with all these fabrics. So you don't need to go all the way, but at least a stitch past that line. This is also why I like to keep the extra paper on the sides. I find it's easier to hold it at my machine with that extra piece, and just for my own peace of mind, it allows me to start further off and really lock that stitch in place, so that when I cut this, I have a good lock stitch and I'm not starting right on the edge. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see on the paper, but there's my stitch. I stitched between B1 and B2. You can probably see it a little better on this side. There's that stitch, and it's okay that it doesn't go all the way to the end. We'll take care of that in later steps. Okay, same thing for the A pieces. I'm just now on this side of the paper instead of on this side. Okay, so we have our B1 and our B2 connected. You can iron this back. I have found I don't like the paper to be ironed that many times, so I use a seam roller, or you can just finger press. Use something to kind of flatten that seam a little bit. And next we're going to work on preparing for B3. You'll see that we have a lot of overlap into that group, much more into that section, much more than the 1/4 inch that we need. So we're going to prepare that. You can use a regular ruler for this, or you can use one of these add-a-quarters, and I'll show you how to use both. So we'll start with the ruler. I line the ruler up on the line that I'm preparing to sew, or that will be my next one to sew, and get that crease, and then fold it back on that line. And remember, I need a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I want to keep a 1/4 inch of it. So I would line my 1/4 inch along with that fold I just made, and then I use my rotary cutter to trim away the extra. And what that leaves me is a line on which to place my next piece of fabric. So for this and for the measurements that are in the pattern, you want to make sure this corner is just a smidge past this dotted line seam allowance, and it should mean that this corner lines up about a 1/4 inch past that seam allowance. We don't need to go much past this one because this is where we'll be trimming it off, but we do want to get about a 1/4 inch. You might be a little shy, but it will work. I have made plenty of these and it works to be at about that spot. Again, I'm going to pin in place so it stays put, and I'm going to put my pin far enough away that it won't interfere when I'm stitching. And I'm going to do the rest, but where I will stitch, again, I'm going to go just a little bit past this line, and then I'm going to do the same thing just a little bit past here, because when I do B4 I will stitch all the way into the seam allowance. So for B3 I don't need to stitch all the way, but I do need to get just a little bit past, make sure there's not a hole or an unstitched part. So I'll do a little past here, back stitch, a little past here, back stitch. But first I'm going to prepare the other pieces, and on this one I'll show you how to use that add a 1/4. So take out my pin, roll the seam back. The add a 1/4 works the same way. I line up the straight edge, fold it, but the nice thing about this is it has a little lift. You can kind of see there's an actual lift. It is not flat on the back. It's got a little lift to it. And so what that does is it just kind of tucks in nicely at my 1/4 inch. So I can pull with this hand and hold it in place and be a little more assured that it's going to stay put. And then I can cut off the excess. And there we have it. So the rest is the same process. It just gives that extra nesting when you're cutting that seam. Line up my fabric. If you are working with scraps and you didn't pre-cut the pieces, again, that is very fine. You'll just want to make sure that when you hold your fabric in spot, that you can kind of guesstimate a 1/4 inch, fold it over, and again, you want to make sure it's at least getting past this corner. You want to fully extend it past the corner. We don't want a gap. Even though this is just seam allowance, we need something there to hold on to when we stitch this piece to the next piece. So you want to make sure it's going into the seam allowance. It might be a little short down here, but I have found that that's okay because you have enough from this fabric and from the t-shirt that it will still hold and keep this piece down here in place. But you do want to make sure it gets past that corner. All the pieces are prepped. It's time to go stitch on the B1, B3 line. Okay, my B1, B3 line is stitched. Now it's time for B4. And for B4, because I have about a 1/4 inch, I have found that I don't need to trim. If you use scrap for this first piece, you might need to follow that same process of folding it and trimming it. But for me and for the measurements that I've given for the fabric pieces, I have found it's just enough. It's fine just to do this. I know this is a little more than a 1/4 inch, so I'm going to scooch this down just a smidge. And then as long as I'm over on both sides, I'd rather be closer to this side. So as long as I'm over on both sides, again, I can do the test. And it's big enough. And then I can pin it in place. And I have forgotten to say until now, the one thing you always want to remember is right sides together. It can be confusing when you attach this first piece because you're putting the wrong side to the paper, but after that it's still the same sewing rules, right sides together. That piece pinned a little off, but it's okay. FPP is very forgiving. It's one of the reasons I love it. So if this were a little skewed, as long as it will still flip and cover, we're good. Okay, we're all pinned and we're ready to stitch. This time it will be B1 to B4. I'm going to go off the edge over here and back stitch, and I'm going to go off over here and back stitch. I want to make sure I back stitch within that seam allowance, but again, I like having this extra paper so I can start outside the lines and finish outside the lines. Okay, my B1 to B4 piece is now stitched. Now we're going to come to B5. This is where it's different on the B's versus the A's. So on the B, we have one big piece. On the A, we have a little piece and then a bigger piece. But the process is still the same. We'll just have an extra step for the A's. So take the pin out, flatten this back. Even though it has nothing to do with this part, it's a good time to roll that back. And then we'll do like we did earlier. Take our ruler or our add a quarter, line it up, trim. And this is where you might see, oh, this one worked out. Sometimes I have a little gap in the fabric here, but remember, this isn't the seam allowance. I mean, this isn't where you're stitching, this is. So there might be a little gap, it's okay. I wanted to be able to use 2.5 inch strips. And so to do that, sometimes this piece ends up being just a little shorter than I need. But in this case, it looks great. So we did that, so now we can flip it. Take our long piece. With this, I cut it a little big so that I can go a little over right here so I can make sure I line up my lines. Because you want to make sure you're going to be flipping this and it's a big long piece. You don't want to go too far. Like I want to make sure, see, I have enough, but I know I have a little extra. So, but you just want to do your best to line this up straight so that it will flip straight. I will say I've had some wonky ones that leave a little gap here because they're a little skewed, and it works out. So you can also always seam rip. I've had to do that too. Seam rip and try again with the alignment. In this case, because it's such a big piece, you could pin it twice just to even more firmly keep it in place, but I'm just going to use one. That one's done and ready to move on to the next one. So you'll see here that my stitch went a little long, so when I'm pulling back to this 1/4 inch, it's pulling my fabric. What you want to do is just kind of shimmy the fabric away from the paper so I can still get in here and do my 1/4 inch cut. Okay, my pieces are pinned, and I'm going to sew on this B5 line, and I'm going to stitch off the edge, back stitch in that seam allowance, and stitch off the edge and back stitch in that seam allowance. So we stitched on this B5 line. Now we're going to take the pin out, roll it back, and this is a long piece and I need it to stay in place. The next step is to trim on the dotted line, and I need this piece to not wiggle, and I've had a bad experience with that. So I'm going to put a smear, and I can see through the line to kind of line up, make sure this is laying straight with that dotted line. And I'm just going to lay it flat. You can also do like a basting stitch, like a big stitch length, but based on how I have my station set up and I don't want to keep changing the stitch length on my machine, I have found that just a dab of glue does it. And you also don't want to pull the fabric, and what you will see is if you pull it tight to get down here, this fabric will kind of curl up, and it just means it's not true to size, and it will provide some wonky quilting later. So I just lay it flat, glued it in place, so now I know when I get to the step of cutting out, it is where I need it to be, and I can cut with confidence. For these A sections, we still have one more piece. we stitched at A5, but now we need to stitch that A5, A6. So we'll go through the process, lay it flat. And again, you don't have to trim. I just find that I get more accurate piecing if I follow this process. If your original piece was cut more true to size, you might not have anything to trim. I left it a little long just in case, and so I do have something to trim. And now this piece is actually going to be green. Just trying to see if I have how tightly I cut this piece. Do I have wiggle room or not? Again, just like before, kind of line it up. Make sure you're lining it up along the lines. I can see it through the paper. And then you're going to pin it in place. And we just want to make sure it's lined up straight so that it will flip and be straight. If you're using a scrap piece, you can test it out, fold it over, and just make sure it goes past, all the way past these dotted lines. I'm going to take these 4 to my machine, and we're going to sew on that A5, A6. I'm going to stitch, I'm going to start off back stitch in here, stitch all the way across, past the dotted line, and back stitch in that seam allowance. Okay, we stitched A5, A6, and now we're going to do just like we did with the B5. Take out the pin, roll it back, dab of glue. This piece is shorter, but I still want to make sure it stays in place, and I just feel better when I do that. Okay, now they are all stitched, and the next step is to cut along the dotted lines. Which should be true to size. Sometimes the paper will shift or warp a little bit when you're stitching, especially if you've ironed. With this, I will just say be consistent to yourself. So I know that I need to line up my hash mark on my ruler with my dotted line and then cut, and then that will be consistent in all my pieces, which will lead to consistent sewing, consistent piecing. You could also realize that the dash needs to be just on the inside. That is, it's up to you and how you want to do it, but just be consistent with yourself. So you could tear off your pieces and you'll go in backwards order. I have found for this step, I actually prefer to leave the paper piecing on, stitch it in place, and then I will remove the pieces. I just feel like it's helping me stitch a better line, even though sometimes I get off that line, and just provide more stability to the piece. I don't know, maybe it's just my peace of mind, but I'm actually going to wait to tear off the paper until I stitch it to this main or the middle square for all the pieces, and then I will tear all the papers off. But you could also tear it off now. If you tear it off now, you just work in backwards order. I will show you what I do for ripping the paper after I attach it to the middle part. I'm paying attention to the line, but I'm more paying attention to my 1/4 inch because that will be the most consistent from piece to piece. This quarter line, depending on how I cut it, even though I tried to be consistent, might be a little off from piece to piece, but I know the line of I know the line on my machine will be consistent. Okay, my sides are stitched. You could iron at this point. I am going to I'm going to rip out the papers, which might involve a little bit of tweezing for some of these small pieces, and then I will iron. But again, you could have ripped out the papers before you get to this step, and then you'd be ready for iron. I will say in advance, when you iron, you can see how it's kind of naturally flowing. There's more bulk on this side than there is in the middle. So you can iron however you want. I have found though ironing to the middle allows this outer part with the extra bulk to just lay flat. So I would just iron it like that. Okay, let's rip the pieces. Again, we're gonna go in backwards order. So the last piece I actually did was create these seam allowance pieces, and you're just gonna fold it back and then gently rip. You don't want to pull too hard. And because we used a short stitch length, it should just tear out. Okay, then when you get to this piece, remember we glued that a little so it might stick a little bit. Just fold it back and rip. And by working in the backwards order, you're lessening the number of parts where it's paper on paper that you're ripping. If I jump straight into A1, I'd have all these seams that are paper on paper. But if I wait, I will end up with just one seam. So next I'm going to come up here to A4. Then I'll do A3. And then between A1 and A2 it doesn't matter. And these are kind of landlocked, so you just kind of pinch at it and pull it. And then this one, just kind of rub it so you can get one of the corners up. And then look closely. You want to try and get as much paper out as you can. I can see there's just a little bit here. It might just stay. And yeah, that looks good. All right, this one is ready to be ironed. I am going to iron to the inside. There's a lot of bulk in the seam, and I have found it's easier for me to just iron in, and it works for me. Because I'm working with t-shirt material and they have decals that I don't want to mess up and I don't want to run a risk of messing up, I could just press on the back side. Sometimes I will also use a silicone overlay or some sort of a mat, a damp washcloth, something to protect both my iron and the shirts. With this stabilizer, I can just stick the iron on it. You could also iron the seams open, whatever you are most comfortable with or think will work best for you. I'm going to give it one good press on this side. And there we have it. The link for the tease pattern is in the description notes for this video. If you make this quilt, or even if you just make some blocks, don't forget to tag at JCT Quilting or use hashtag JCT Quilting. I'd love to see what you make. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing the process of how to do foundational paper piecing with memory fabric. And I hope this video was helpful as you try it on your own.